Well, Boris Johnson is back in front of the reopened House of Commons this evening, facing questions from MPs about his failure to prorogue Parliament and his plans for Brexit. The Prime Minister rushed back from his visit to the United Nations in New York early this morning after the Supreme Court said his suspension of Parliament was unlawful and then promptly cancelled it. In a typically robust speech at the dispatch box just minutes ago, he said the Supreme Court had been wrong to get involved in what he described as a political question. Labour's Jeremy Corbyn described him as dangerous and not fit to hold the office of Prime Minister. Well, Mr Johnson is being questioned by MPs in the Commons now by the former leader Ian Duncan-Smith. Let's have a listen into that now.
I understand now that his government has changed the root origin of the term yellowhammer to describe the botched attempt by the leader of the opposition to dispatch his own deputy. And could I ask him? I received and saw in my constituency, as others did recently, leaflets from the Labour Party calling for a general election now. Could he answer me this question? Can he give me any reason why we are not having an election at this particular point? Does he think for any moment it could be because the leader of the opposition fears his own party just as much as he fears us?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend for his very acute question, Mr Speaker, and I'm afraid the answer is very simple, that they don't want an election because they are not sure that the public would trust them with the government of this country, and I think that they're right, and I think that they put the yellow into yellowhammer, Mr Speaker.
Well, the Prime Minister there on very robust form, it has to be said. Well, with me now is political editor Gary Gibbon. Gary.
I think the great question in people's minds with what happened at the Supreme Court was, will this lead to any kind of change in government strategy? It looked as though bits were falling off the strategy. I think what we saw today was, right now, as we speak, no, that strategy has not changed. The only thing that really changed today is that they've doubled down on the rhetoric. The first clue was Geoffrey Cox, the Attorney General, very strident language attacking this Parliament and saying it should disperse, it should go back to the electorate, it should shut itself down for good. And then we glimpsed Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's chief aide, coming to the House of Commons with him. That's a sure sign the strategy hasn't changed. And then we heard Boris Johnson putting it up to the opposition and saying, you don't like this government, you're trying to make me powerless. I paraphrase, but that's more or less what the Attorney General said earlier. Let's have a general election, and why don't you table a vote of no confidence? It doesn't look as though he's going to table his own bit of legislation which could trigger such a thing, but he is telling them to do it. They're not going to do it, the opposition, because they think that it's a trap. It's a trap that he would use to try and make sure that we slid out with no deal on the 31st of October. They're not going to go near that, but what are they going to do with these extra days that they've gained for themselves? Not at all clear. I think they've been slightly bounced and there's a bit of disagreement. Should you tighten the noose a bit more on the Prime Minister's hands and maybe even restrict him a little bit more, tightening the timetable on how early he has to commit to trying to get an extension on Brexit? No uniformity of view on the opposition there. So the only thing we can really say that we've learnt today is that the rhetorical lines that were developed by Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson, Parliament versus the people, are still very much the lines that the government is trying to work on. This was a day that started, of course, with a grey RAF plane crawling through the grey skies above Heathrow.
Dragged back early from New York, the Prime Minister had sent Parliament away. The Supreme Court had called it back, and Boris Johnson had to turn up to be questioned. His every move tracked from the air like a US crime show following a fugitive. Past the London pad of the Queen, who he dragged into his failed enterprise to suspend Parliament. While he freshened up, his parliamentary tormentors were at the gates, talking of more laws to tie his hands.
If anything has been shown in the last few weeks and months, it's that Parliament can be innovative and inventive.
So you might have to force feed him with some other legislation.
If we have to, we will do so.
The Speaker's procession began the parliamentary day that wasn't meant to happen, pulling MPs back from around the world, and one just married, abandoning a honeymoon.
You got married on Saturday.
On Saturday.
Meant to be on honeymoon today.
Yes.
And then you're sitting watching the court judgment to see whether it's going to happen or not.
Rock and roll, isn't it?
But the sudden return of MPs meant they didn't have the usual packed agenda on the order paper, but a blank sheet. MPs demanded the Attorney-General explain his legal advice on suspending Parliament. He declared this Parliament finished.
This Parliament is a dead Parliament. It should no longer sit. It has no moral right to sit on these green benches. This Parliament is a disgrace. This Parliament is as dead can be.
It's not the rhetoric you'd expect if you're a government about to seal the Brexit deal and have to charm this Parliament into voting for it. The Attorney-General was accused of lacking any shame over the Supreme Court's judgment.
Mr. Speaker, I came into the chamber today thinking I felt sorry for the Attorney-General. But as he started, I did. Fair enough. But every word he has uttered, no shame today, no shame at all. The fact that this government cynically manipulated the prorogation to shut down this House so that it couldn't work as a democratic assembly. He knows that that is the truth. And to come here with his barrister's bluster to obfuscate the truth, and for a man like him, a party like this, and a leader like this Prime Minister, to talk about morals and morality is a disgrace!
I'm not sure I could discern in that marshmallow of the rhetoric any actual question.
I must raise my concerns about the Attorney-General constantly saying that this Parliament is dead. This Parliament was elected in 2017. It reflects the divisions in this country, the divisions in our communities and the divisions in our families. Cease this language of pitting Parliament against the people.
Did you get it wrong, Mr. Cummings?
The Prime Minister, with his casually dressed main advisor Dominic Cummings, in the last few minutes finally got his slot in the hastily thrown together Commons agenda. A few hours after his own Attorney-General suggested he was heading a government that cannot govern.
It is absolutely no disrespect to the judiciary to say I think the court was wrong to pronounce on what is essentially a political question at a time.
Order! Whatever the strength and intensity of feeling and the passions to which these matters give rise, we must hear.
I think they should listen to this, Mr. Speaker. They have until the House rises today to table a motion of no confidence in the government. Come on then. And we can have that vote tomorrow. Or if any of the other parties, the smaller parties, fancy a go, they can table that motion and we'll give you the time for a vote.
In the words of the Supreme Court, this, Mr. Speaker, was 10 minutes of bluster from a dangerous Prime Minister who thinks he is above the law. But in truth, Mr. Speaker, is not fit for the office which he holds.
Some whips have been checking up this week on whether some leadership campaign teams defeated in July by Boris Johnson might be stirring on manoeuvres, sensing the Prime Minister's reign might be short.
If you look at it like this, we've just gone through a leadership election, literally within the past 2 months. So it's still raw, it's still open.
Febrile.
It's febrile. The cabinets are coming together.
Everybody's wondering whether someone's going to make a move.
Exactly. And
what do you think?
My gut feeling is I think there's always one, isn't there? Let's be truthful about this.
Someone might.
There's always one.
This is one of the most exciting times possible in Parliament.
Jeremy Corbyn's supporters insist that the Labour leader stands ready to move into number 10 if Boris Johnson's government is removed. But some MPs say it can't be him heading any caretaker government and talk of other names as temporary premier.
Margaret Beckett or Ken Clarke or Hilary Benn.
All those are possible
running
people.
a government for a few months.
To
get a referendum.
100
ministers appointed from different parties.
quite willing to do it.
Policies across the range of activities? You can't just freeze everything.
You can't freeze everything, but you have to act in the caretaker capacity for most things and look after, make sure that nothing goes horribly wrong.
So a kind of zombie caretaker government that's just stewarding us towards a referendum?
Well, if it gets us a referendum, I think that, by its very nature, says it's not a zombie government.
Parliament's first day summoned back was dominated by demands from the government to close it down again for a general election, which the opposition won't grant them until Brexit is delayed.
Well, with me now is the former Justice Secretary David Gauke and the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey. Ed Davey first. Boris Johnson's thrown down the gauntlet. Vote of no confidence. Why don't you do it?
We want to get Boris Johnson out as soon as possible. He's a lawbreaker and he's running a very incompetent government. But we also need to put the national interest first, and that means stopping no deal, getting no deal off the table. And Joe Swinson for the Liberal Democrats has put forward the idea to other party leaders, because we want to work cross-party. I'm proud we're working cross-party. And the idea is that we bring the requirement for the Prime Minister to ask for an extension of Article 50 earlier, so we can get no deal off the table earlier.
How soon?
Well, that would be up to other parties to agree with us. We'd like to bring it forward a week or even 2 weeks, and that would give us more time. And then, when we got it off the table, then we can start talking about a referendum or a general election.
So within days, how do you feel about that, David Gauke, forcing Boris Johnson to go back to Brussels sooner to request an extension?
Well, the reason why the trigger date was the 19th of October was because that was after the European Council meeting on the 17th and 18th of October, which is the last opportunity to make progress towards getting a deal. So it still seems to me reasonable to wait until that process has been completed. If the Prime Minister hasn't got a deal at that point, then it is right that we trigger the Ben provisions and seek an extension. That should leave enough time to deal with any attempts to get out of the legal requirements, for the courts to look at this if necessary. So I think that's enough time to do it on the 19th of October.
But isn't the Prime Minister right when he says the only way out of this is a general election?
No, I don't think it is. I think the way out of it is that we try to get a deal, that the majority in the House of Commons can support whatever that might require. And I think there is an onus on the Prime Minister and the government to redouble their efforts in terms of getting a deal, in terms of being realistic as to our red lines with the European Union, not asking for things that can't be delivered, and then working across the floor of the House to try to find a majority in favour of a route forward.
You're determined to block any deal, you've made that clear, so you're thwarting the will of 17.4 million people.
Well, there was 16.8 million who voted the other way, and Liberal Democrats have always been consistent, been clearer than any other party, that we want to stop Brexit. So I'm certainly not denying that, but we want to do that in a democratic way. So we think the best way of doing that is a people's vote, and we will continue to argue for that. But if the other parties refuse that vote for the people, so they could democratically choose to remain in the European Union, then we'll have to have the general election. And in that general election, we will campaign to stop Brexit. We've done that all the way along. Unfortunately, from the Labour Party, you have complete confusion. And from the Conservative Party, from this appalling Prime Minister, you have chaos.
Are you tempted by a second referendum? Because you've always resisted it.
I have. I would much prefer to leave with a deal without having a second referendum. That remains my preference. And the point I would make to a lot of my Conservative, perhaps I should say former Conservative colleagues, is that if they don't back a deal, then there clearly is a move towards a second referendum. That is the direction that we're going in. I don't say that with any great enthusiasm, but that's why I hope all Conservative MPs can get behind a deal. But the onus is also on the Prime Minister to get that deal.
When the Prime Minister talks about abiding by the law, but also leaving on October the 31st, does that mean some kind of shenanigans, which means we're going to end up in front of the courts again?
Well, I can't see how you can abide by the law and leave on the 31st of October unless you have got a deal. And I don't understand how the Prime Minister thinks he can do both unless he thinks he's going to get a deal.
The problem is no one trusts this Prime Minister. He's lost all credibility. He's been found out in the courts. We know he's a perpetual person who breaks his word. And some people are now talking in this House that he's lied to Her Majesty the Queen. So because he's lost that trust, that's why Liberal Democrats are arguing for getting no deal off the table as soon as possible, because we just don't trust him. Imagine if we get to the 19th of October. Imagine if he then doesn't seek the extension as the law requires and we're in the courts. There's a danger that we could slip out of the European Union. And that's why we, as the Liberal Democrats, are leading the charge for an earlier no deal off the table, an earlier extension to Article 50.
Is that something you back?
I think there is time from the 19th of October to the 31st of October to go through the courts, to do everything that we need to do to ensure that the Benn Act is triggered, enacted and the extension achieved.
Is he dangerous, the Prime Minister?
I don't know whether I'd describe him as that, but I think
How
it
would
is.
you describe him?
Well, I think it is important that the Prime Minister, I think, does need to change his strategy. He does need to try to unite the country to a greater extent. I think he does need to reach out, and I think he does need to be pragmatic and practical in terms of delivering a deal and not making demands that simply are not going to be achieved.
David Gauke, Ed Davey, thank you very much for joining us. Well, in the last half hour, Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, asked Mr Johnson about his conduct in public office with reference to his alleged links with the US tech entrepreneur Jennifer Arcuri.
The Prime Minister also has questions to answer about his conduct in public office. And in particular, allegations that he failed to declare an interest in the allocation of public money to a close friend whilst he was Mayor of London. It was announced today that the Department of Culture, Media and Sport is reviewing the funds allocated in the light of the Sunday Times report. Did the Prime Minister initiate that review? Will the Prime Minister fully cooperate with the DCMS review and that of the Greater London Assembly? Will he refer himself to the Cabinet Secretary for investigation? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, no Prime Minister, is not above the law.
Oh, and I am very proud, by the way, to take his next point, about everything that I did as Mayor of London. I may say to the current Mayor that he'd be better off spending less on press officers and more on police officers in London, because we were funding 20,000 more on our streets.
Well, Mr Johnson has insisted that everything was done entirely in the proper way, while the Culture Department says it's investigating a grant worth £100,000 to one of Ms Arcuri's companies. So what do we know so far? Our political correspondent Paul McNamara has more.
Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer Arcuri and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Hacker House.
Hacker House, a firm of ethical hackers that received a government grant of £100,000. But what MPs want to know is whether there's a conflict of interest between the nature of the relationship between the firm's CEO and Boris Johnson and the allocation of public funds. As soon as Parliament reopened today, they queued up to ask the government department with their hands on the purse strings.
I care very little about the personal life of the Prime Minister, but I care a lot about how this government manages conflicts of interest and how it spends taxpayers' money.
This is fundamentally a question of character and of suitability. Is the Prime Minister of sufficient character to occupy high office and disperse public funds?
Will the Minister reassure the House that there will be no other examples of friends with benefits funding from DCMS or any other department?
Awkward questions, and today the Digital Minister confirmed the grant was being reviewed.
We are, of course, aware of the claims raised recently by the Sunday Times, and the department is reviewing the decision that was taken, but we monitor all initiatives that have been...
And there were further questions as to whether the firm should have even been eligible for UK government money, as most of the staff and business appear to be based in America.
This is a company that is based in Britain as far as Companies House is concerned. It is a company with a British phone number. We will review that, but we have no reason to think... We have no reason to think that there is anything untoward in this particular matter.
That issue of the UK number was seized upon by Tom Watson. He said that when members of his team tried to call it, it went through to America.
Thank you for calling Hacker House. Please note this call
Sounds like an American voice.
In fact, when we called them earlier on, after that pre-recorded message, we got through to someone from the firm and they confirmed they're in California.
They told us they had offices in the US and the UK, but didn't provide further details. Questions of conflict of interest first arose when the Sunday Times revealed another tech firm Miss Arcuri ran received grants from a London mayoral organisation while Boris Johnson was mayor and had joined trade missions abroad.
Well, we know that she was on 3 trips, but there was a trip to the Far East in November 2014 when the mayor was specifically asked a question to name all the Delhi members of the delegate, and he gave names of all the members of the delegation apart from one name. The name he missed out was of Jennifer Crewery. And it's interesting why he missed the name out. Was it just sort of forgetfulness? Was there anything else behind it? We want to give him the opportunity of answering those sort of questions.
The Greater London Assembly Oversight Committee have asked Mr Johnson to provide details of any relationship. Both the Prime Minister and Miss Arcuri insist there is no impropriety.
Paul McNamara reporting there. Well, the Prime Minister is still on his feet in the Commons. Let's just have a listen to what he's saying in response.
And I'd like to hear from them that they will, Mr Speaker. We will, I'm very confident, make progress towards getting a deal, and I hope it will command their support.
Yvette Cooper.
Earlier today, the Attorney-General did not just say that he would respect the Supreme Court's judgment, he also said, we got it wrong. The Prime Minister has today just said the opposite and effectively said he thinks it's okay for a Prime Minister to cancel Parliament for as long as he so chooses in order to not to answer questions. Many of us have had disagreements with his predecessors, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, David Cameron, John Major, Margaret Thatcher, but none of them would have done this. None of them would have been so chaotic, none of them would have shown such disregard for the rule of law or tried to concentrate power in their own hands by cancelling Parliament in this way. Why is he so entitled that he thinks it's one rule for one person and one rule for him and a different one from everyone else?
Mr Speaker, I think the historical record will reflect that several Prime Ministers, and I think all Prime Ministers have had prorogations, and John Major, for instance, prorogued for several weeks, I think, in advance of an election. But on her substantive question about the view of my right honourable lady colleague, the Attorney General, about the judgment yesterday. Let's be clear that we are as one in respecting the Supreme Court, and we are as one in thinking that judgment was wrong.
Well, Boris Johnson responding there to some pretty forthright criticism from the Labour MP Yvette Cooper. He does appear at the moment to be rather enjoying the exchange, but how long that will last, we'll have to wait and see. He'll be on his feet for a while longer. Now over to Jackie on the Green in Westminster.
Thanks, Cathy. Well, with the prospect of a no-deal Brexit still very much on the table, the Minister in charge of planning for one, Michael Gove, has been insisting that many businesses are well prepared. Labour's Keir Starmer rejected that idea, saying that to leave the country unprepared was unforgivable. Well, we've seen documents given to one Manchester hospital and no doubt replicated across England, revealing the concerns many in the NHS have about the future. Our health and social care correspondent Victoria MacDonald is with me now. What can you tell us, Victoria?
Well, Jackie, in fact, Michael Gove went on to say that most of the work to mitigate the risk of a no-deal Brexit had actually gone into the NHS. And I know that civil servants have been working very hard in the Department of Health and Social Care to try and alleviate this risk. Nevertheless, as you said, there are concerns. These documents have been given to will be presented to the board at Christie's Hospital tomorrow, and they lay out the concerns that are being felt across the country. Isotopes, for instance, needed for scans. Now, the government has said that they can be flown in, so there's no risk of them being held up at ports because they have a very short shelf life. But what we don't know is what happens if those flights can't make it. We don't know if there are enough drivers. There are concerns about drugs. What happens when the stockpiles get low and they have to start replenishing them? This document also went on to say, which was quite sad in a way, about anecdotal evidence, so there's no proof of this, that trials. UK researchers are starting to be left off trials that are across Europe because they can't come to the table, as it were. And then there is now an announcement that NHS England will require trusts from the 21st of October, so just 10 days before that critical date, to start giving daily reports on where they are with the planning. I can give you some good news. The flu vaccines have arrived in the country, so if you need a flu jab, you should be safe.
Victoria McDonald with a little bit of good news. Thank you very much for joining us. Well, all this continuing uncertainty over Brexit has spread right across Europe. In the Netherlands, businesses exporting to the UK are warning that long border delays could prevent fresh produce from getting to shops quickly, leading to empty shelves. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman has been to Rotterdam, Europe's biggest port, to talk to Dutch exporters and to one British company which has moved there.
The pallets of fruit and veg whizzing about this Dutch warehouse are destined for Sainsbury's, Morrison's, Asda and Lidl, with around 30% of the UK's food imported from Europe. And with nobody knowing if Boris Johnson can strike a Brexit deal by the end of next month, Dutch businesses, like their British counterparts, are feeling paralysed by uncertainty.
This company is exporting fewer of these pallets to the UK than it did a year ago because it says some Dutch growers have pulled out of the British market, believing it to be more trouble than it's worth. But the biggest concern here is the amount of time it takes for this fresh produce to reach supermarket shelves in Britain. And it's feared that the time could double.
Daily Fresh has spent hundreds of thousands of euros planning for a no-deal Brexit. And although Parliament has legislated against that outcome, it may have only delayed it, which means import tariffs and new border checks at British and Dutch ports.
This scenario of possible shortages of food in British shops, is that a real scenario or is that some sort of scaremongering?
I think that is a real scenario, yeah. I think there will be some days of empty shelves in the UK, yeah. I think supply chain really has to get used to the new way of working after Brexit.
Merci. And customs officers will have to get used to it too. In Calais yesterday, French officials were rehearsing their response to a no-deal Brexit scenario, having spent €6 million to recreate a frontier with the UK which had all but disappeared. The French say they're confident they can cope, though a freight industry source told us the port was prepared to waive cargo through for up to 1 month if the checks on day one risk causing chaos. In the Hook of Holland, the Dutch have built this overflow car park for lorries which could be turned back from the port if they don't have the correct paperwork. Parliament's attempt to get Boris Johnson to ask for a Brexit extension beyond October does at least give European haulage firms more time to prepare. But the traffic isn't all one way. The UK is Holland's biggest foreign investor, with hundreds of British firms now talking to the Dutch government about moving here. On the first floor of a Rotterdam office block, this is the board meeting of Vitesse PSP, which operates a business-to-business bank payment system worldwide.
I think as long as we've got it for the Brexit situation.
18 months ago, it moved its HQ here from London at the cost of over £1 million to give its customers the certainty of European banking regulation.
Isn't a move like yours ultimately going to put British people out of a job?
Inevitably, over time, it will do. As we grow, when we have part of our workforce here and we have part of our workforce in the UK, that means that there are people in the UK that have not got the opportunity to get those jobs.
But this chief executive and most of his staff still live and work in the UK.
But you must admit there hasn't been a mass exodus of financial services people from the UK to Europe. I mean, lots of companies haven't left.
No, they haven't. And I think it will be interesting to see when we finally get a result, whether it's going to be a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit, which of those businesses that didn't move are going to be affected. And there will be a lot of businesses that will be affected.
British inward investment doesn't ease the pain of Dutch exporters. Royal Lemkes is Europe's biggest supplier of plants, sending 50,000 of them to the likes of B&Q and IKEA every week. 8 people here have been tasked with preparing for Brexit. though despite the can-do spirit, nobody knows what kind to expect.
This is our holy Brexit flow.
Your holy Brexit flow.
Yeah, so the single point of truth.
Unless there's a transition period, the supply chain director says the 9 current checks and stages for each delivery could more than quadruple to 40.
So in principle, for a normal order today to UK, we need this first part and then we need this last part. And everything in between is something extra for Brexit.
Right, so these are the new stages of compliance that you have to go through.
Yeah.
How much more to your business does all that cost?
So the duties that we have to pay to the UK government for importing plants are not decided yet on. Depending on the outcome of Brexit, it costs more than 5 till 20% on the cost price of a plant.
So your customers don't know how much to charge for the plants because they don't know what your costs are?
That's true.
So if I go into a garden centre in, I don't know, a few months' time, are you saying some plants will be 20% more expensive?
Yeah, that's true.
By the time these pumpkins are out for Halloween on October the 31st, either Brexit will be agreed or Parliament could force the Prime Minister to go back on his word and postpone it. The government talked today of simplified import procedures, of goods flowing across borders without duty being paid. But until and unless there's a new free trade agreement after Brexit, nobody really knows how European ports and exporters will be affected, or the costs that British consumers could ultimately pay. Jonathan Rugman, Channel 4 News, the Hook of Holland.